Welcome to everybody who is here, and to those folks that will be joining, I'll say a welcome, and if they listen to it in the archive. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of ThoughtStretchers Education. Just a quick bit about us and our work. We do a lot of professional development. That is the main area of work that we do. We work with schools in the U.S. and around the world. Looks like I may be in Pakistan here sometime soon, and talked with a school in Uruguay this morning. So it should be interesting to make some of those trips. We do a lot of project-based learning work, differentiated instruction. Everything I like to say is through the lens of inquiry, and you can find that at wegrowteachers.com. The community that this discussion has been hosted through is our ThoughtStretchers Education Community, which I started after several folks kept telling me we need a place where we can talk about education things that's not like Twitter and toxic and polarized and all those kinds of things. So we're making a run at trying to do that, and it's a heavy lift for sure, because lots of folks like to say they don't want to deal with the toxicity of Twitter or places like that, but it seems like they might. And that's certainly where a lot of the action is going on. But anyways, we're happy to have you here. You can find that at thoughtstretchers.org, of course. And of course, we have our podcast, which is the ThoughtStretchers Education Podcast. So you can find that on Apple Podcasts and all those kinds of places that you find your podcasts. So with all of that said, I'm going to ask our two guests that have joined us for this discussion, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and kind of give a little bit about themselves before we get going. And then we'll do some questions and answers kinds of things with me. And then I'm going to try to open it up to you all. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, there is a little hand, and you can raise your hand when we start to get into that session, and we'll try to recognize those. I'll unmute and try to get those questions out as quickly and reasonably as possible, and have some discussion, because that's what this is all about. But let's start off with having Mary Thomas-Vallens and have her introduce herself. She is with Braver Angels, which is one of my, and actually not one of my, it is my favorite grassroots polarization organization. I'm a big fan, have been a big fan since when they were called Better Angels, but then they changed names. Several of the folks, including John Wood Jr. was on the podcast, Monica Guzman, who I'm a big fan of her work and really does some great stuff in this space as well. But Mary is going to introduce herself, and she works with the education sort of branch of that, but I'll turn it over to you, Mary.
Yeah, I'm excited, and I'm impressed you've been around with the Braver Angels way back when. It started in 2016. So for those of you who don't know anything about Braver Angels, it's a nonpartisan nonprofit that works to bring people together from many backgrounds to have productive conversations, especially when they disagree. And I've been in workshops that I've had pro-life, pro-choice people working toward finding common ground. So I do a lot of things. I'm on the moderator training team. I do the moderator monthly workshop. And then I plan just say one time, hey, anybody bringing this down to teenagers? And it was a year and a half ago. And so now ever since January of 2023, we have a group that meets monthly to talk about how we can involve youth in having and learning about productive conversations. So I hope that's enough of a background. I do have a background in inquiry and teaching and critical thinking and all of that. Everything, Drew, you have on your website, I'm just going, yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, when Mary and I first connected, we connected by email, and then we had a conversation by Google Meet or one of these video platforms. And, it's similar to, and the same thing with Melanie, like we get on a call and all of a sudden it's like 45 minutes later and we're talking about all of these things, because it's just, it's that intellectual nourishment that I think we're all after, and trying to find that complexity and nuance and sort of like minds. So Thank you, Mary. And so then Melanie, I actually first heard on a podcast, which was about science teaching, that a friend of mine who's an academic coach and now a good friend of mine heard and said, you probably like this. And I would listen to it. I said, yes, I really like this. And so I reached out, and Melanie and I connected and had one of those long conversations. Melanie does work with several organizations. Thinking is Power is her main group. And then I think it's the Mental Immunity Project and the Center for Inquiry, but she can go into that much more. She makes very interesting and I think entertaining videos. We joked about how silly it would be for me to try to make such videos, and they'd be entertaining for different reasons. But critical thinking is her jam, and I'm going to turn it over to Melanie to introduce herself and tell a little bit more about her work. Oh, you're muted.
Like, you'd think during the pandemic I would learn better. Thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here, and to be on with Mary is such an honor. My background is, I'm a biologist and I'm a professor at a college, and I just over time got to thinking, if I had a single semester to teach the average person what they needed to know about science, what would it look like? And I love biology, but it was not intro bio. So I designed a course to replace it that I say teach skills, not facts. So that would be critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy. And then in the process, I thought, well, maybe people want to hear this stuff. So I created a website and social media accounts, Thinking is Power, based on the idea that knowledge is awesome, but there's a lot of it, and we carry access to basically all of it in our pockets. So the question is, when you need information, can you find it and use it to make better decisions? So thinking is power. And I the education director for Mental Immunity Project. I'm a fellow for the Center for Inquiry, and a science educator turned communicator, and not just science communicator, critical thinking, because, you know, I'm not saying critical thinking can solve all of our problems, but it is probably our best shot.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And I guess let's start by sort of operationalizing some of the terms here. So critical thinking, breaking the polarizing fog of misinformation and tribalism. That's the title of this. So maybe the best place to start, Melanie, to have you talk about this, because I know this is right in your wheelhouse and your jam. Like, how do you define critical thinking?
You know what? You'd think that'd be an easy question, but it is not.
Right.
And I have learned that. So critical thinking, there's basically two ways to think about this. One is deep thinking about a topic, and you have to have deep content knowledge to do that. I actually am among the other school of thought now that thinks critical thinking is a set of dispositions that things like reducing black or white thinking, or the ability to recognize the limits of your knowledge, or welcoming criticism from others, being skeptical and curious. And so to me, critical thinking is the ability to be aware of what you know and what you don't know, be curious about what it is that you don't know, and be willing to find it from others, being open to hearing what they have to say, and then using that information to make better decisions.
Gotcha. Okay, so and Mary, I'd like to see if you want to build on that, but I also want to pull in, because I think this is more in your wheelhouse, certainly Braver Angels' wheelhouse, the ideas or the term polarization or polarizing, maybe misinformation and tribalism, and how do you maybe define some of those things, and if you care to speak about how you think about critical thinking and how that shows up in your work.
Okay, so polarization, we talk about when disagreements, when viewpoints, when ideas turn into anger, disdain, contempt, and really ridiculing and dismissing whole swaths of people because of what they think or believe, or what you think they believe, because that's where the tribalism comes in. People stay in their comfort zone. It's easier to be around people that agree with you. It's amazing. I mean, a real shock of polarization, how people are literally moving from state to state to be around people that think more alike, rather than embracing the wonderful diversity. And I know diversity has become a hot topic, just that word, but I tell people, if you think half the country is wrong and awful, and then you think about our country from Florida to Alaska, we are missing so much. I mean, that half or whatever group you're thinking about can't be all those things that you've summarized in your head. So, and where it relates to critical thinking is one of the terms that we've really adopted with Braver Angels is political empathy and humility. The idea that we don't know everything and that it's best to be curious. So many of the things that Melanie mentioned are really what we embrace, is building personal relationships with people to hear their stories and be curious about how they came to the ideas that they hold. And asking good questions.
Yeah, well, of course, right? So you mentioned humility, and that is one of the things that we use in our work, our objective pluralism work, trying to help educators navigate some of this culture war kind of thing, right? So really leaning into the Enlightenment liberal principles, fallibilism, empiricism. And one of the things that we start our workshops off with is a sort of asking them, the participants, to think about, like, how willing are you to be wrong or to change your mind? And that for us sets the scene and really does that in a way that helps us to have some conversation that otherwise might be really challenging if you don't set some of those norms. And Melanie, I know one of the things that you do, you and I talked about this privately, and your sort of entry point and how you sort of lower that barrier is a little bit different. And if you could kind of talk about that, because I think it's an interesting way and certainly different than what I have proposed there.
So I think what you're referring to is what I have discovered in the process of teaching critical thinking, information, and science literacy is that the order matters. And I am blessed with the luxury of students not having to know anything by the time they leave me, because it's a non-majors class. And also with students are captive for 4 months. They want a grade, and so they have to stay with me. And I start by fooling them. Is that what you're referring to, Drew?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I literally, day one, I start by fooling students. I give them fake personality assessments. Bertram Forer made it famous around 1950. So I put up this whole ruse. I have a friend who's an astrologer, and she's agreed to do these personality readings, and I give students little questionnaires, and then the next class I give them their readings, and I say, okay, now how accurate was she? Over the years, on a scale of 1 to 5, they say she's about 4.3 to 4.5 out of 5, which is what Forer found as well. And then I have them get with other students and talk about why they thought their readings were so accurate. And sometimes it can take them 10 or 15 minutes to realize they all got the same reading. And then I get to tell them, like, look, okay, I lied to you. Am I sorry I lied to you? Like, well, kind of. But I did it for a reason. It's for educational purposes, and I did it for free. Now let's talk about why I might do this. And I explained to them how I fooled them. Things like the Barnum statements and confirmation bias. I appealed to authority. I primed them. I did all these kinds of things to fool them. And what I found is I could tell people I could fool them. But most people think that's what other people do. I'm too smart for that. I'm like, hold my beer. I'm going to show you I can fool you. And so I just do it to prove to them I can fool them. And then when we're done with the lesson, okay, we were basically all fooled by this. If you don't want to be fooled, then we want to learn critical thinking skills. But also realize none of us are above this. And so then I get to start the lessons. And actually, importantly then, I don't then go into triggering information. So I think it's really interesting, the work that you do, Mary, because because I had the luxury of time, I go into witchcraft next and ghosts, and like I work my way along this spectrum where I start with things that aren't necessarily triggering to identities for most people. Mm-hmm. And I move along the spectrum as the semester progresses, but I start with what I call training wheels. Critical thinking training wheels, where I teach them what that feels like to process information without being personally vested in it and triggered by it, so that they can build up those skills and advance to something else.
Yeah, the identity piece that you mentioned there, I think, is a really, really interesting and useful leverage point here, because while in my estimation, I think we want to lean into, we want to recognize people's identities because those things are important. But for us, we really want to emphasize our shared humanity. But those identities, we don't want to, again, discount them, but we want to value them and all of those things that sort of go along with that, but we want to make sure also that they're not getting in the way of our thinking. And so that to me, that's the tribalism piece, right? It's like, I'm a red or I'm a blue, which is what Braver Angels uses. You know, you can use the different tribes, the left or the right, or, you know, in the reading wars, there's balanced literacy versus science of reading, or whatever those things might be. And there's a sort of what I think they call it the popular front kind of idea, right? It's like, my side believes in this, so, well, I guess I've got to believe in that too, because the other side believes, you know, I've got to fight that side. So Mary, in your work, and maybe you can describe like what that work really looks like in the schools and working with those students, and to the extent that you sort of address those identity pieces in that work.
So first of all, with Braver Angels, we don't do everything red, blue. Sometimes we just refer to people who disagree with you, the other. So there's a couple different things. Like one, with teens, we have them brainstorm in small groups. Think of a time that you had a conversation that turned into an argument. So without sharing the personal details of that, what behaviors, what happened? And they can readily share the behaviors. And so we have those established, and that this is for one particular skills workshop. We do lots and lots of things. They're all a variety, but this skills workshop seems to be one that I'm getting asked to do more and more with teens. So that sets up our goal. Our goal is, okay, we would like to not have these behaviors, especially when people disagree. What can we do? We also talk about polarization and what it is, and it depends on the age level. So with middle schoolers, sometimes we're talking about football teams, pizza versus hamburger, whatever is relevant to them. We really have taken the politics out of the middle school and high school unless the group wants it. I'm finding in Braver Angels, even with adults, people are sick of identifying red, blue. They are sick of it. So a lot of the work we do, and I did this common ground workshop I mentioned with pro-life, pro-choice, but I had a high school group that discovered Braver Angels. Someone attended one of my online workshops, and he wrote to me. He was part of a leadership group in Birmingham, Alabama. So when you hear what they wanted, just keep that in mind. This was a group of parochial and public school high schoolers, and they said, we have no sex education in our schools, and we have the highest rate of chlamydia. And we as teens want to do something. So they knew about the Common Ground workshop, and it's not a debate, it's looking at an idea. So for that is, how can we teach sex education in schools, the public school and private school? And then we had kids that took a little survey to identify a side. So one would include talking about all kinds of sex education, you know, homosexual, what we're not talking sex acts, by the way. We're just talking about what you'd expect in informing teens about being responsible and dealing with the world. And
so
then
you weren't grooming them, you're saying?
We weren't grooming them. But we had to be really, really careful, as you can imagine. So this workshop ended up being with a lot of parents watching. But the other, and then there was a view of the other side that, you know, whether or not you include birth control in sex education, whether or not you talk about other reproductive rights. So that kind of workshop, students meet in there, and this is the same with the pro-life, pro-choice. People meet in separate groups first, going through their values, concerns, and solutions on a particular hot topic. That's how this works. And then they come up with their unanimous agreements within that group. And then the two groups come together, and then they look for the unanimous agreement between values, concerns, and solutions between the two groups. Before all this, which is really important, is people share their personal experience or relationship with the topic. And that is really important. When you have a pro-life person tell their story about why they are pro-life, it changes the conversation across the board. And so anyway, we've had topics with teens on sex ed. We had kids contact me in my community. It was during COVID when lockdown was lockdown this spring. And the teens wanted an input on their future about whether they were going to go back to school or not in the fall in person. So we did, again, it was a common ground workshop on that topic. The students had pro and con in that group. They came together with several unanimous agreements, and then I got them to present it to the school board virtually. The school board actually incorporated all their ideas in the plan. And this is a school district of 35,000 kids. Those teens felt empowered. So that's a lot of the work we do. It's not just workshops. It's helping kids feel like they can have a voice and agency in the world that really drives them crazy right now.
Yeah, what's really interesting that, because you say that you're hearing, especially from the young generation, the youngest generation and the teens and that, that they're sort of tired, like they're not interested in the red, blue, and they don't want to talk politics. And that's resonant with the conversation that we had in last week's event, which was on catalyzing community-led change and how to sort of overcome these divisive things. And in that conversation, what really came to light was that when you get down to the community, that the people really wanted to get things done, and they didn't want to have the arguments. They didn't, what we see on cable news, social media, all those places is actually a fairly small minority, but it's just really noisy and loud, and it's really dominating all of our discourse in really terrible ways. But it also highlights, when you're talking about the community and how you're working with people that are right there in front of you. And it's the same kind of dynamic, right? When you hear those stories, you see that shared humanity. They're actual people and that's very different from, obviously yelling at them online, or even, Google Meets that you see, some evidence of that kind of thing. So I think that is a really important piece. I want to shift gears a little bit to thinking about some of the epistemology, right? Like, how do we know what's true? And Mary, you're welcome to chime in on this as well. But Melanie, I think, as I think about your work, this is really, I think, relevant. One of the things that I'd seen recently, some of you very likely had seen as well, the big throw going on with NPR and, whether they were captured by woke ideology and blah, blah, blah. And as part of that, the CEO, I think was her title, or is her title, I think her name is Catherine Marr. But there was a TED Talk going around where she was talking about the idea of we all sort of have our different truths, or some version of that. I'm not saying it correctly, of course. I don't have it committed to memory, but it struck me, and I tweeted and I said, I think she's confusing truth with perspective, because there's a difference to me between truth and perspective and belief and opinion. And to the extent, Melanie, that you can sort of clarify some of those things. I mean, we have that from, if you want to call it the left, we have alternative facts that, was it Kellyanne Conway that was notorious for saying we have alternative facts. And, I have a family member that I was talking to recently, and I said, boy, this stuff that's happening on these campuses, some of it looks eerily similar to January 6th. And the retort was, well, January 6th was the evidence shows that it was an inside job and it's a conspiracy. And I'm like, oh, wow, it's a set of alternative facts. And so, Melanie, I'm curious, like, can you sort of unpack how you think about epistemology and truth and knowledge and all of those things, belief and perspective and those kinds of things?
Yeah. So how much time do I have?
Right.
Okay, so about that clip, I saw that clip going around, and it was just slightly over 2 minutes long. And there were aspects of that I thought she was spot on, and other aspects I thought, ooh, I'm not sure about this. I will admit I did not watch her full TED Talk, so I don't know what the totality of her message was. But I do know, with students and because I spend a lot of time online communicating science, I do run into a lot of people who have versions of their truth. And I think that's the essence of your question. Am I right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's with the process of science, because I'm a science educator, what we're trying to do with science is to understand the natural world. And that is based on an assumption that there is a real world that exists outside of our head. And if you don't think that's true, then, walk out of your top story floor and see what happens. I'm not actually saying you do that, but like we do all seem to understand at a fundamental level that there is a real world. So we're trying to understand that world. But I think a lot of people confuse their personal experiences with the real world. And I spend a lot of time in class building up why we need science. And I think this is what a lot of science classes miss. They start with, here's the process of science, and then here's all the things that we know. As opposed to, why aren't scientific journals filled with, I know ghosts are real because I saw them. Or I know homeopathy works because I tried it and I felt better. Right? There's a reason that our personal experiences aren't sufficient evidence. And that is because we are easily fooled. Richard Feynman has that famous quote, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So understanding that, recognizing our individual limitations, if our goal is to understand the outside world, then we have to open ourselves up to other perspectives, and because they offer other testable hypotheses. It doesn't mean that they're right or that they're right for them. It means it allows us another version of reality to test that maybe we haven't considered yet. And that is a really important lesson. I spent an entire section on the limits of our perception and memory. And again, I start with all these different ways that your perception can fool us. I mean, eyewitness testimony is the single biggest cause for convictions that have been overturned. And the reason for that is we think we can trust our personal experiences. They are telling you something important, but they may not be telling you what reality is. And so if your goal is to understand reality, then we need to understand that we only see an aspect of it, and potentially one that's flawed and biased and emotional. And so listen to others who might be offering something else. And we're in this together, right? We are not on separate teams here fighting for my truth and your truth. Our goal is to work together to understand the bigger picture. So because of that, with that said, here's what I've seen. Here's what I've experienced. I understand I might be perceiving this wrong. I understand I might not have the full picture here. What do you have that might help me understand this better? I use the dress, by the way, because the dress is such a wonderful, the dress is such an example of like everybody understands that we all see it differently, but it's still so much fun to sit in a room full of people and go, wait a minute, really? You see that differently? So you let them fight it out and then go, okay, now wait a minute. What if instead of like trying to convince somebody that you're right and they're wrong, leaning into that and going, wow, you see that differently. That is fascinating. I wonder why. Let's explore this together.
Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
I wanted to jump in because what you describe about perception and curious and what is exactly a braver angel pathway. So when you started out with truths and all of that, I was listening carefully, and what I've discovered is when, being a teacher and wanting kids to learn and explore and find the facts and figure out how you know what to believe and what is true and all that. And then I get to Braver Angels and all this conflict, and we find out that people don't agree on facts, and arguing with facts does not work. It doesn't do any good. It just, when people are really polarized. But when you do exactly what Melanie said about, Guy, you see that differently. Tell me more about it. I want to hear, I want to understand. It changes everything. And if I can tell a very quick story that'll emphasizes, my dad just passed away. He's almost 100 years old. So for, 55 years of my life, he and I have been on different sides of everything, and yet he was a great dad. But in high school, I argued with him as a sport. When I got to my 20s, I matured a little bit. I actually got tired of it. When I had my kids, I thought, well, this is not good modeling. And then fast forward, in his 90s, I started around the time I joined Braver Angels, I started taking my dad to these monthly doctor appointments. And thank goodness I was in the parking lot with speed bumps, because after about a year or two of this and Braver Angels, my dad said, it was right before the last election. He goes, Mary, I'm going to vote for your person. I literally slammed the brakes. If we had been going 5 miles an hour, I don't know what would have happened. I would have had cars slamming into me. And I go, Dad, what happened? I was shocked. This has never, ever been possible. He said, well, I've been trying to figure this out. And I go, why? He goes, well, we've been driving and you've been listening to me. You've been asking me questions. You haven't been debating me. So instead of you using your facts and your reasons and why, and debating why my facts and all my ideas are right, you've allowed me to express my thoughts and share, and you've asked questions, you've been curious, and suddenly you have influence. You convinced me. And I stopped trying. And that is, Braver Angels will say, one in our goals, we are not here to change people's minds. You can come in and be whatever you are in your thoughts. We just want you to be able to have a conversation that is productive and not hateful and whatever. But many people in Braver Angels have discovered you have influence when you stop trying to push your view. And that really happened in this. And my dad, it was a gift. The last 3-4 years of his life, we had the most amazing conversations. And it was all because with my own dad, I became curious, where with my students, I've always been curious and I've modeled curiosity.
So I'm going to shift. I'm going to say a couple things, and I'm going to ask if anybody has a question or something they want to add. You can use a little hand down there at the bottom, and I'll try to recognize you and bring in. But it's really interesting because I was going to actually ask about that, Mary. And one of the things that we're talking about, the fog, is how do you sort of break through that? And, of course, Monica Guzman does really great work. And I think the podcast was a Braver Way podcast, definitely worth listening to. And she shares some of those examples, including a personal one of her own. But how do we, and I'm not sure that you can necessarily have an answer for this, because it is such a fog to break through, when we say, all right, if we're trying to model that and be curious and ask questions, and I try to say, try to understand and be understood. I often get accused of, arguing with folks, and sometimes even on like Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, or maybe even Facebook with a different crowd. They'll say, they'll feel like we're arguing. And I say, well, I'm not arguing with you. I'm just trying to clarify my position. And I'm okay if we disagree. But I just want you to understand where I'm coming from. And of course, everybody, or not everybody, that's a bad word to say. So bad term to describe it. So we say, lots of people want to win, like they're trying to convince. And so that's a problem. But then it takes two to tango there, right? So if you're engaging in that way, like you seem to have been doing, and your dad recognized that, but not everybody does, right? Not everybody wants to engage like that. They aren't curious. They're not using those same kinds of norms and that approach. So to the extent that you might have a solution for that, or an answer for that, how do you break through? Because to me, that's one of those big pieces of fog, right? It takes two to tango. And sometimes I just say, well, maybe just we're not going to tango. And Melanie, feel free to chime in too.
Yeah. Do you want Melanie to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, there has to be a readiness. I mean, this is not, Braver Angels does not solve the most extreme people that just do not have a readiness to have a conversation. What we're finding is a huge number of people who will never make the news are sick of what they're seeing in their communities. They're sick of the school board meetings where there's fighting. They're, And right now, the Mideast crisis has kind of blown up everything even more.
Mhm.
Like, I thought we were making progress, and now I'm seeing things that are polarizing in ways that I hadn't expected. So I think the thing that when like at a party, someone said, oh, you're in Braver Angels, and they were really wanting to rip me, in terms of find my weak spot. And I said, I'm so curious about how the energy that you have behind this question. Like, tell me more where that's coming from. And I meant it from a very, tone of voice matters so much. I'm really curious about your thoughts behind this. And I just kept asking questions of curiosity and really trying to listen and really trying to make the person feel heard. That is the number one step. And that's what we teach teens. They want to be heard, but we also, want to show them the skills. One other thing, in some of the workshops, we have the people do, I was also smiling when you were talking about your little tests. We have a 6-question questionnaire that people answer in one of these workshops, the depolarizing within. It's like, how often do you celebrate in your head or with like-minded friends when the other side, blows up in the news or whatever? There's all these questions that get you to think about the kind of polarizer you may not realize you are. And I never thought I was like that. And I answer these 6 questions, and it's like sometimes, always, never. And I kind of went, oh, geez. Uh-oh. I do that. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. That awareness really helps. So you have to have a door. And when there's no door, you just listen or agree to disagree. I mean, I'm not going to go talk to someone who's, in my face yelling.
Yeah. And Melanie, if you have anything you want to add to that, but again, if any of you have a question or something you want to add here, use the little hand down there and we'll get you in. So Melanie.
For me, because I have 2 primary places where I'm active. One is in my classroom and the other one is online. And online on social media is really difficult. And so like, especially Facebook is my biggest site, and I spent a lot of time building a community there. And my general rule is, if you're just honestly a troll, you're there just to break things, then I'm going to ban you. And there are some people who come in with extreme views or misogyny or whatever it is, and they just get banned. It helps the rest of the community there. Those people are vocal and they're obnoxious, but they're not most people. But it just takes 1 or 2 of them to pollute the entire comment section and take the experience away from everybody else. So I get rid of them, and then the rest of the community there they're pretty good about encouraging each other to have productive conversations. And I will step in and I'll model. And sometimes that's not even for the benefit of the person that I'm speaking with, because maybe they're on the far end of that bell curve as well. But there's a lot of people who are watching a conversation, the spectators, and they're still getting things out of the conversation, even if they're not involved with it. But it's so easy to be drawn in by the emotional, terrible people. But they're the extreme. The majority of people, I often joke that my communication is for the normals, right? Those in the bell curve, right? People over here don't really need me. People over here can't really be reached with my timer skill set. I'm not writing anybody off, but with my abilities. There's a lot of people in the middle. And I hold out hope that there's enough of them, that if we reach enough of them and we create a space for enough of them, that they make those on the extreme moot.
Yeah. Well, I can't believe nobody's raising their hand. This group is just, oh, there we go. James has got it. All right, go ahead, James.
Sorry, I was waiting for you to open it. I didn't want to appear like I was
too eager.
I have 2 questions. One is a really short one for Melanie, and then a larger question for both Melanie and Mary. Thank you both for presenting and for the work that you're doing. Melanie, in your university classes, and I'm asking this as a 18-year veteran IB economics teacher, how many of your students were IB trained, or we're coming into your class on critical thinking with an IB background?
I can confidently say, if not none, close to zero. It's because I teach in an urban community college in southeastern Mass, and the closest IB program is quite a ways away.
Okay. But you're familiar with the IB concepts and TOK and everything, right? For the both of you, the question maybe more chewy, and this comes from, I've become obsessed with Vanessa Andreotti's book, Hospice and Modernity, which I don't know if it's an amazing book. It's actually given me a lot of hope in the face of all this polarization. But I'm curious as to how often it comes up in your conversations about that we tend to argue and fight and dispute from a very Western perspective. And how often does it come up that there's other ways of interacting with indigenous community ways of knowing, more non-Western? Does that ever come up as a possibility, or enters the realm as maybe we do it this way? And I'm a native New Yorker, and my wife is from Alabama, so we argue very differently, right? And when we're in New York, I get to argue my way, and when we're in Alabama, we argue our way. But but that's still all Western, right? So
James lives in Mexico, by the way.
Yes, I live in Mexico, so we neutral ground. So as other cultural perspectives come up, I guess is my short version of the question.
Mary, you want to take that first?
Well, for me, it does. In the community that I'm in, there's 50 languages spoken in Irvine, and we have people of all faiths, all over the spectrum, and a big Asian community. So, when we're talking about listening skills, making eye contact, well, eye contact is not acceptable in all cultures, especially if you're a kid. So, I have to really ask kids to help me understand the things in this workshop that won't work for you. And I've done some homework on that too, but I can't say that I am immerse myself in all sorts of cultures where I'm bringing other than a Western view. But there is an awareness brought up about, we talk about in some of the skill workshops that we all have different perspectives, and it's based on family background, it's based on cultural experience. So one of the ways we get people to talk to each other is say, based on my Greek heritage, blah, 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 or in my family, I'm the first generation to attend college. So my experience sounds really different than yours because you had a college prep teacher and you had someone help you write essays or whatever. So just maybe in a surface way, I would love to say more, but we do talk about perspective and personal experience a lot, and hopefully capture, allowing people to share their knowledge with the group about how they would view it.
Melanie?
Because I'm in a science class and our goal is objective truths as opposed to various subjective like values and so on. I think it's quite a bit different. I have a lot of immigrants in my class, and they provide a wonderful perspective on various things. Something that comes to mind when I talk about ghosts in class. So because what I want students to understand is the evidence for something like that. And so oftentimes the best evidence for this is personal experiences. Well, cultural beliefs influence how people perceive something like ghosts. And so they can tell wonderful stories from their different perspectives, but all of that serves my purpose, which is, well, this is still an objective claim. So what you've done here is you've provided me with evidence for the fact that these experiences are subjective and not objective. So a different experience.
Yeah. Well, now we have a couple hands raised, and Len, I'm going to get to you. One of the things that I think this is a really useful question because it is sticky, right? Because there are perspectives. This brings me back to that perspectives and beliefs kind of thing. And, if you've taken a look at the guiding principles for our community, the ThoughtStretchers community, really leaning into those Enlightenment liberal principles, which are, of course, Western principles. So, thinking about making sure that we're following the fallibilist rule, which means no one gets the final say, but then the empirical rule, which is no one has personal authority. And so that objective truth is determined not by somebody's perspective or belief or their identity, but it is by actual evidence. And that's really, really important. But then, of course, we also have to remain open to those different perspectives, because the scientific process and well, I would say liberal science in this case, it requires that we continue to value those other perspectives to make sure that we're right, or if we're wrong, we change our mind. And so that's really, really important. So Len, go ahead.
I'm a braver angel, by the way, and I'm also a retired cognitive psychologist, but I read a lot of social psychology, and I don't know, for me, thinking is an activity. It's my thoughts aren't an attribute of my identity. Of course, easier said than done. I'm human too, but in my work and all the reading, our thoughts are so easily manipulated, as Melanie showed in her class, by the fake questionnaire and by so many things. And it would be good if you, and maybe you do that. You have in Buddhism and meditation, you're taught in a very different way that you are not your thoughts. And our thoughts are so easily manipulated by, what happens in the waiting room before the social psychology experiments that you've no doubt all heard of, that you think what's happening is irrelevant. So like what I come up with as my opinion on this subject now could be very different from what I come up with another time, based on my mood, cues, and what the group thinks. And I guess, of course, it may not be relevant for Melanie when you're teaching objective science, but for someone who's teaching about political opinions, like political scientists, that it makes all the difference. You come to see it that if you get people to see how easily their opinions are changed, for instance, by the group. What if you knew all the facts but didn't know anybody else's opinion about it? Are you sure you'd have the same opinion you do now?
Yeah. Well, I'll relate some stories or some writing that I've done, because getting out of the hard sciences, which does have sort of objective truths, and I was a social studies teacher and a psychology teacher, so match those two things together and think about how I approach that. And of course, what we really want to make sure of, I think, is that we're teaching things like social studies and politics and government and all of those kinds of ideas that are a little bit less hard and more squishy, to say this is what we believe is the accepted truth, and now this is our set of knowledge. But that's of course always open to revision and all of those kinds of things that liberal science allow us to do. That said, there are other perspectives and other ways to look at this. So I have pushed back heavily on folks on the right who are trying to ban DEI or critical race theory or those kinds of versions, and talked with my local legislator and said, if I were still teaching and you told me, by this bill, basically I couldn't teach about the 1619 project, and I said I absolutely would. I actually had this state representative's son in class years ago, so we have a little bit of a relationship there. And I said, I would absolutely use the central question of the 1619 project, not because I believe it to be true, but because it's a heck of a way to get that learning started and provides a different perspective. And so we want to make sure we're valuing those perspectives and those other ideas, but still saying, all right, so here's what we believe to be true. And we've come to that by consensus, almost like a social media hive, because all of the different ideas have sort of clashed in, you can say, a marketplace of ideas. But of course, that is always subject to change. So thanks for that, Len. Zafir, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. If you want to unmute and join us.
Yeah, very well done.
Thank you.
So a question for Mary. Do you think that expressing or acknowledging uncertainty in our own position, even quantifying uncertainty in our own position, could be a tool
Absolutely.
to help reduce, but also maybe not end a conversation in the thought terminating cliche of agree to disagree, like actually being able to shift each other's positions a little bit? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's where that humility comes from. It's really recognizing that I don't have all the answers. Our side, if we're doing sides, isn't right all the time. And, the thing that we also talk about in terms of polarization is stereotyping and how that leads us to dismiss. So recognizing, so we talk about breaking down stereotypes and how to avoid stereotypes. And that's realizing that people are nuanced, that they're complicated, they're more varied, their ideas change, new information comes, new research comes, new discoveries comes, and everything we thought is no longer true. So there's a lot of things about ambiguity, change, not knowing that actually opens up the conversation. And I know this is jumping back to a prior thought. I don't want to leave anybody thinking that we only deal with people in the middle. So I literally was in a workshop. This was online. It's the red-blue stereotype workshop, which is really powerful. And I had someone in the introduction say, I am a no apology Trumper. And then I think that stirred someone else to say, well, I am a socialist, but I'm not a Bernie Sanders socialist. I am a socialist. So they're in the room and I'm online. And the thing is, by the end, and I thought I was pretty new to moderating at the time. And this was like 50 people online across the country doing Zoom. And in my head, I was going, and then, but because there's some ground rules, there's activities, there's things that are structured to get people to share their views without being challenged, it opened it up. So one of the things, I think this may lead to some of this ambiguity. So the question is, what are the stereotypes I think the other side has of my side? What's really true from my perspective? But then also, what are the kernels of truth, meaning where did those stereotypes come from? And admitting that, like maybe with abortion, like I'm pro, not me, but the person, I'm pro-life, blue, I'm pro-life. Yeah, but I personally wouldn't have an abortion. There's a lot of people that support babies or whatever. We're not, the stereotypes were baby killers is where it would come from. But the kernel of truth, yeah, we're working on this legislation. We're advocating whatever. So having that, these are the stereotypes. This is why the stereotype's not true, but I'm willing to admit there are people in my group or even within me that have things that don't fit. We're not one identity. That was one of the most powerful workshops I attended. In fact, I went to that and I wanted to be a braver angel immediately. And then people discuss what they learned from each other. And what they find out is there's a lot of misinformation about each other.
Melanie, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I introduce a thought, like an experiment to help students think about their thoughts at the very beginning of the semester. And then I have
maybe a thought stretcher?
Maybe. Rename it. So it's based on like the street epistemology approach, the Socratic questioning. And the first question is, how sure are you that this is true? And I have them put it on a spectrum, 0 to 100. And I'm encouraging them to avoid extremes. So don't put 0 or 100 on it. put it someplace, and then I ask them things like, how would you test if this is true? So I want them to figure out if this is actually a testable claim or not. Is this a falsifiable claim or is it not? How would you feel if you were wrong? So the kind of emotional attachment that they might have to it. And then the why do you think that you're right? But more importantly, why might you be wrong? So not just leaning into that, well, you said you're 90%. Why are you that confident? We can always give people reasons for why we think we're confident, but I want people to think about why they might not be right. Because I could give people reasons why they might not be right, but they won't listen to me as well as they'll listen to themselves. And then with the same kind of claim, as we go through various topics, I bring it back up and I'm encouraging them to alter their confidence with new evidence. Zafir's question is getting to Bayes' theorem here. My students are, am I understanding you correctly, Zafir? Yes. Yeah. My students have, the class has a very low math requirement, so I cannot rely on math here, but it doesn't need to have math involved. I literally just want them to go, well, I was 90%, but now there's more evidence that I might be wrong than I thought. So I don't know, maybe I'm 80% now. And that's still a win, because what that did was left more room open for why they might be wrong about something. And the point is that we don't have to be yes, no, right, wrong, true, false about something. It's not a binary thing. It can be on a spectrum, and you're not married to the confidence that you've provided. You can move that with new evidence. And you know what? It's a good thing to alter your confidence with evidence.
You know, can I just jump in again? Yeah. It's so amazing how your science examples kind of match a Braver Angel example. So in this red blue workshop, one of the activities, so this is people are identifying in public red or blue. That's one of the ones that's very much like that. So one of the questions is, why are your side's policies good for the country? And so they share. And then the second question, which is the more important one, what concerns or what worries do you have about your own side's views? And when people share their lack of confidence, like you said, in their view, when both sides do that, oh my gosh, there is again another open opportunity for, oh my gosh, you're willing to admit you don't have all the right answers. You're willing to admit there's some downsides. You're willing to consider that the other side may have a better idea on that topic. And that same kind of activity is one of the ones that really brings trust. That I've shared what I think is great, but I'm also willing to consider the unintended consequences of my view, which is really big with me. Unintended consequences. What are we missing here?
Well, Melanie, as you were talking about the street epistemology, and I'll put a link to a podcast that I'd done some time ago with a guy named Reed Nicewanderer who does street epistemology. And I remember coming across that. I think he has a YouTube channel called Cordial Curiosity. But this street epistemology stuff is for me as an inquiry teacher, an inquiry focused kind of educator, it's like catnip. And I was just like, wow, this is so awesome, right? It's so fun to watch somebody take somebody through the steps of epistemology using inquiry. And Kate, she put in the chat, about, listening, and it looks like we lost her. So one of the things that I really believe in, or believe to be true, I wish I could actually test this, is a hypothesis, is that 1983 we started, we had a Nation at Risk, which is a national report here in the States that basically said our schools are getting our butts kicked, and that set us off on a course of decades of high stakes accountability, No Child Left Behind, those kinds of programs. That not necessarily is bad. There's certainly some good things to go with that, but it disincentivized and made it harder for teachers to do the kind of Socratic seminar, inquiry, epistemology, I would say, intuitive, well, intentional and intuitive inquiry. And so I think that there's a downstream effect that we're seeing, in addition to several other things, social media and politicians and things like that, that is contributing to our polarization. So that's my plug for, like, how do we get more, what I would say, rich inquiry back into our schools, and that's, you know, really big part of my mission. So hopefully I'm pronouncing this right. Nadav?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Drew, you said just now exactly what I was about to say.
Oh, sorry,
I wanted to
stole
make
your
a
thunder.
connection to that exact history, and I was going to reference those exact stopping points. But my point being that the high stakes accountability data, those testing, when you have to have an answer key, answers have to be right and wrong. It is that binary, and there is no critical thinking because students can't argue and get in there and get nuance and perspective, which is what our volatile, uncertain, complex world is all about. And so I'm wondering, my question was, is there an awareness that these standardized tests, so just to make the map onto our current polarization, I think that when you grow up in a system that tells you someone else is going to give you the right answer, you learn their answer, they have the right answer, that's it, it's theirs, don't worry about why, right? Listen to that answer, and then just, make sure you know those answers that were given to you. Then people go into the real world and they read a magazine or watch a news, and that is their source of truth. And then they regurgitate it, and they don't know the thinking behind. That's why if you listen to them long enough, they get to the point where they can't actually defend, because they haven't done that deeper thinking to go into the critical thinking that leads to that perspective. They're just regurgitating something else, and then they kind of find themselves at a loss. But my question is, are you, in your experience, are you aware that students in particular are aware of this impact of standardized testing and that type of thinking where you're given answers? Is that something that people are aware of, that could be part of our polarization and part of the issues we're having, or not?
Mary and Melanie, I'll give you an opportunity to answer, and if, to the extent that you want to, if you have that experience. My experience is probably not, especially in the lower grades. I don't think kids are generally they don't have the wisdom and the self-awareness to have thought about that. We do a lot of work in inquiry and project-based learning, and when I was teaching and trying to do project-based learning, I would have students that would say, how do I get an A? Just tell me what I need to do, right? They have been sort of schooled in that way. And so I think that reality, they just don't have the self-awareness quite yet. There's probably some exceptions to that rule, certainly. Do the adults know that? In my experience, no. It's the people who work in the space of inquiry and researchers that I talk to, and like Peter Gray, if you're familiar with his work, and Lenore Skenazy, who's a friend of mine, and she's been on the podcast a couple of times, and Let Grow and Giving Kids Independence. Those kinds of folks, I think, do see those connections, even if they don't explicitly make them. But I don't think most people do, and that's unfortunate. I think it's also important to recognize, in that push for more inquiry, that we don't sacrifice actually good building of knowledge, because number one, I'm sympathetic to the argument that someone like E.D. Hirsch would make, which is that we really benefit from having a shared set of knowledge. Culturally, that sort of is something that we can all use as a touchstone. So I think that that's a really important piece. And so when we say we want to do inquiry or project-based learning, we also want to not forget that direct and explicit instruction and building of knowledge is also important. So Mary and Melanie, if you want to add anything to that, feel free.
I really can't talk from great experience beyond my own school district. I was really very lucky. Irvine Unified, the method was teach well, don't worry about the test scores, they will do their job. And that's, it's been a school district for 50 years, and that it's always been that way. Project-based learning, inquiry, even from kindergarten. How do you know? How did you find out? What, what is your evidence? Is that evidence reliable? So I know it varies all across the country. I know because my work I'm also a student teacher supervisor for a university. And I go into classrooms all over the county, low income, high income, not Irvine. I think we shortchange. A lot of teachers are doing really good work and asking really good questions, and whether or not they can handle, standardized testing is still there, but I do think critical thinking is happening in many places, but it probably doesn't get the airtime that it deserves. And, you know, there are people trying to get rid of standardized testing. That's definitely something that we hear a lot, but to really comment nationwide, I'm not qualified.
Go ahead, Melanie.
Yeah, my concerns here are really related to, so if I limit what I'm about to say to middle and high school science, the standards that the NGSS, Next Generation Science Standards, that the vast majority of states are adhering to, they require critical thinking, but that is the different definition of critical thinking that I started off with. It is based on deep content knowledge. What's most concerning to me is that those standards don't even mention misinformation, and they only tangentially relate to source evaluation. So my concern is that it leaves a lot of students with the impression that they have the ability and are even expected to, for the rest of their lives, think deeply about any science-based issue that they're faced during their life. And they're not taught how the broader process of science works, how certain sources are more reliable than others, and how to find that information. We put the onus on students as opposed to teaching to be independent thinkers, with my scary air quotes, as opposed to
oh, she froze.
What? Okay, is this better? You know, my background.
Yeah.
So as opposed to, you know, as scientists, my background is plant ecology. Like if I wanted to read about the impacts of fire frequency and intensity on plant diversity in prairies, I'm on it. But mRNA vaccines, you know? So if I wanted to learn about that stuff, I wouldn't dive into the literature and expect to understand the body of evidence, the research methods, the statistical methodologies they use, and the broader context that those things are in. I would find the most reliable source of that and try to figure out what the consensus is. So I guess what I'm saying is that the standards, the tests that are teaching to those standards are, you know what I mean? They are addressing a specific concern, but I think they're leaving out what a lot of students are having to deal with in the information environment that we live in today.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, I want to wrap us up and give Mary and Melanie an opportunity to share any links and resources and things that they would like. I would definitely recommend checking out all of their sites, both of the sites that are associated with them, or all of the sites that are associated with them. I'll remind folks that we have our PD site, which is wegrowteachers.com, and then of course the ThoughtStretchers community, and trying to build this. So if conversations like this are useful and valuable for you, and hopefully the community is as well, please share the word, because we'd love to continue to try to build that. Like I said, it's a heavy lift, and it'll take, you know, a number of people joining and being a part of it to then make other people see value in it. But of course, that is, as I said, a heavy lift. So yeah, Len, I will put the sites in there as well. And why don't we start with Mary, if you want to say any parting shots, any parting comments, and, you know, the links and all those kinds of things.
Well, I was going to admit, I go, please don't ask me first. I don't know how I want to wrap up. I have lots of other stories and things. What I'll say related to teens is when we get invited to work with them, or when they seek me out, that's happened many times on their own. Students, kids are looking for civil thinking role models. They don't think they exist. When they're in our workshops, so instead of an evaluation, I give them all Post-it notes, or we put posters all over the room and they write their reactions. I mean, they are just mind blowing. You know, I didn't know I could have a conversation. I'm going to use this with my dad. We teach skills, listen. So when someone talked about active listening, listen, acknowledge, well, listen to understand. and we practice, all of it's very interactive. We practice how to listen. Acknowledge what you hear, make the person feel heard, agree when you can, even if it's agreeing that there is a problem. And then the secret sauce is this pivot. This pivot skill is it okay? I've listened to you, I've made you feel heard. You don't actually say that, but you've done that. Now you kind of ask, is it okay if I share my thoughts? Or I would like to share what I know on the topic, and you wait. So pivot and pause. Every person who ever learns that skill, and I'm a communication psychology major, I didn't learn pivot. I learned all the listening skills, but I didn't learn that pivot. And then you share your reaction has been so powerful. So what happens is if no one I have encountered says, no, I do not want to hear what you have to say, when you actually ask sincerely. And if they do, then that's a signal. Well, then this is probably not the time to have that conversation. So I don't know if that was an ending. That's just something that kids really have identified with and really seem to want to have those skills.
And the site is braverangels.org. I almost said my own. braverangels.org. And again, there's a podcast that has gone along with that. A few different iterations of it. John Wood Jr.'s done some of those, and they go way back. But then Monica Guzman has her Braver Way. And I don't know if they're going to do more. They did a whole series of them, and they were great. And definitely look those up on Apple Podcasts. But yeah, go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to say there's also a very debate program, and the debates are to learn and understand. They're not to win. And the strategies they use to get people to really express strong opinions and really back it up with data, back it up however you debate. But the goal is not to win. And the way they do it is fascinating. So they have a high school and college program for that, and a national adult program for debates.
Yeah, and I put our two main sites there, and then I'm going to put a link to our page that has our podcast. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can find it. I will just say that late last year, we switched names from Teach Thought Professional Development to ThoughtStretchers. So if you listen to previous podcasts, it'll say Teach Thought, and you'll be like, what in the heck's going on here? So Melanie, how about you?
Well, I'm not sure what else to add without opening another can of worms. So I will just say that I've been really honored to be here and be with everybody. My website is thinkingispower.com. I actually have a foundations mini course based on the course that I developed on the website. And I'm doing a lot of work with educators now to try and help educators incorporate these different strategies about critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy into their classes. So I've got assignments and activities and so on there. And I'm on social media. I spend way too much time on social media. So please join me and make my time worthwhile. I'm on Facebook and I have a YouTube channel and all of the other ones. It's at Thinking Powers. And yes, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, she makes, like I said, really fun videos. Sometimes her cat is in them, and who knows what else and where she might be, because she tours around the country with her musician husband. And last time I talked to her, she was in a hotel room in, I think, New Haven. But who knows? But again, thanks to everybody for joining. I really appreciate your interest and the conversation. Again, please share all of those links and the work that Mary and Melanie is doing or are doing, and our work as well. So with that, I will sign off and say thank you again.